I'm very pleased to be joined by two members of the New York City Council. From Queens, Councilmember David Weprin, and from Brooklyn, City Councilmember David Yassky. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
This is a very timely show because we're in this unprecedented meltdown on Wall Street, and at the same time, new administration in Washington, changes in Albany in the political dynamic, the role of the City Comptroller, perhaps even more critical than ever. So we decided to do an early forum, an opportunity for candidates for Comptroller to be able to speak out. Our audience should know that we invited City Council member Melinda Katz from Queens, who's also a candidate for Comptroller. She had been expected for our show this morning and had a late-minute cancellation. We hope to have another opportunity to speak with her later. And we're going to take some time on this conversation because I think it's important. So I appreciate your making yourselves available. I know how busy both of you are. With the change in the term limits law, both of you could have run for re-election. David Weprin, you are the chair of the Council Finance Committee, one of the leadership positions. David Yassky, you are one of the more prolific law writers in the council. Both of you would have been sure shots for re-election. Instead, you're giving up that opportunity to run in a contested primary for City Comptroller. Why?
Well, first of all, we got elected in 2001 under the term limit law. We were actually the first class of term limit babies, so to speak. And, we kind of, at least I played by the rules. I assumed I was going to be in office for 8 years. And I actually was planning, with my background, to run for Comptroller. This is something that was in the back of my mind early on. I have an extensive background in finance. I served as Deputy Superintendent of Banking for New York State. I was on Wall Street for 20 years in municipal finance. I chaired the Securities Industry Association, New York District, and now I've been head of the Finance Committee for 7 years. So I kind of planned on running. I thought what Mayor Bloomberg did on proposing a change in the term limit law at the last minute without a public referendum was wrong. I took a leadership role in opposing that legislation. I voted against that legislation. And I'm not planning on running for re-election because I was planning on running for Comptroller, and I plan on continuing to do that.
Why run for Comptroller? Because there's so much we need to do. The Comptroller is the chief accountability officer. It's the chief economic officer for the city. And at this crucial period, that's what we need. We need to get more service for the dollars taxpayers are putting in. That's what a Comptroller can do by emphasizing results and accountability. And we need to get the economy back on track. And a Comptroller can be enormously useful in helping that.
How do you do that?
Well, two ways. First of all, we've got to scale back the city government and the burdens it places on the economy. We have to have a government that makes it easier to do business here rather than harder. And sometimes the government, far from helping business, actually gets in the way with taxes, with fees, with unnecessary regulation. That's part one. Two is, the Comptroller, as the chief investment officer for $100 billion group of pension funds, is a major economic player and can use economically targeted investments to both bring in returns for retirees and to make investments that help the city economy.
So let me ask you this question. Mayor Bloomberg's principal claim to fame, if you will, is that he brought a business-like approach to the management of city government. Do you think that Mike Bloomberg has been a good manager? And can you give us an example that would suggest that either he is or isn't a good manager?
I think he's been a good manager, yes. I could give several examples. One, a good manager sets out a vision. 311 has increased the responsiveness of the city government, has helped the agencies function more effectively. I think that's been an important innovation. There are many things I've disagreed with the mayor on, to be sure, but has he been a good manager overall? I would say yes.
What do you think, David?
Well, overall, I think he's been a good manager, despite my disagreement with him on the way he went about changing term limits, kind of bypassing the voters, not having a public referendum, despite the fact that it passed twice. I also thought he made a mistake putting so much emphasis on his congestion pricing proposal, which, by the way, not only would have hurt the outer boroughs, Brooklyn and Queens, but I thought it would have had a negative effect on Manhattan residents as well, because you would have had people trying to avoid the zone, so to speak, driving around, parking. It would have affected small businesses disproportionately who rely on people coming into Manhattan. I just thought it wasn't well thought out. Certainly we have to do something about traffic in Manhattan. I had some other proposals, and I can get into that if you like, other than charging people to go from one borough to another and kind of dividing the city.
It's interesting. I'd say, congestion pricing is a good example, although I would say that shows important traits of leadership, long-term vision. We can't just be planning for next week and the week after. We have to be planning for 10, 20 years down the road. Innovation. We can't have business as usual. We certainly can't have politics as usual. If we do that, we're heading straight back to the 70s and the fiscal crisis. And I think that idea, was it all good? Of course not. Very few things are. It had minuses, but it had pluses too, and it showed an ability to plan for the future and an ability to be innovative.
I have heard the mayor say that New York is an expensive place to do business, but it's a place where business has to be, and therefore pricing, in effect, is not as critical in his thinking. It made me think that in his own business, in the Bloomberg company, he came up with a device, a piece of technology that everybody on Wall Street had to have, and therefore you couldn't really negotiate the price. When you all came into office, as the smoke was still drifting over the Trade Center from the horrific attack on September 11th, and the city was in a serious economic crisis as a result of the halt in activity there, the mayor and the council made the decision not to cut services, but instead to raise property taxes by a substantial amount, balance the budget. And that, in part, provided both the framework for the recovery, because the city's economic condition bloomed after that, but also a huge amount of surplus revenues that could be applied in a variety of ways. So in some ways, it's the same thing. In other words, the price, he raised the price of doing business in New York, and that gave him, because people didn't have a choice. I'm
so glad you raised that, because that is the mayor's philosophy. I think it's a mistake. I really do. Sure, for some businesses, for Wall Street, that has been true. We'll see if it is in the future. But for many, many businesses, certainly small businesses, that's just not the right attitude to say, we don't care how much it costs to do business here. That's why I've pushed tax credits for film production, which have been very successful. And we got that passed with David's help. And that's brought a lot more film jobs here. That's why I pushed a cut in the unincorporated business tax for small businesses and freelancers, which has been successful in helping them thrive. And again, David was very, very helpful there. That's why, and again, we collaborated on trying to roll back some of the parking fines that businesses that make deliveries, they're getting crushed out there. A florist, a food delivery place.
But all of those are small dollar amounts relative to what's happened with the property taxes.
Yeah. Overall, I think it's important that we trim but not cut. And I say that because in tough fiscal times, we have to be compassionate. Government has to be compassionate. People are suffering. The middle class is suffering. Everything seems to be going up. The middle class is being squeezed, and we have to be very careful of that. The strength of our city is our middle class. We want to encourage people to stay in the city. We have to have a good school system. We have to have provide basic services so people will say, that it's safe to live in New York City. Public safety is paramount, and the perception of public safety is paramount. So you have to have a balance. You have to trim, but you have to be careful about total cutting, because we still have to be compassionate, especially in tough fiscal times.
Well, I've also heard the mayor say that when pushed to close a gap, politicians very often point to waste, fraud, and corruption as a way that they're going to be able to make up some of the difference, but that in his experience, there really isn't that much waste and inefficiency in how city government does its job. As the Comptroller of the City of New York, as the chief audit officer for the city, do you think he's right that there really isn't much in the way of savings based on additional efficiencies?
Not at all. I think there's a lot of places you can trim, and that's Comptroller's office can absolutely do that. A comptroller isn't just putting out financial statements. You got to do that, and they got to be right. but controller can look at what's the productivity of the agency. How much are you spending in dollars per output for the agency, and is it growing? Is it growing 2%, 4% a year as we expect the private sector to do? So a controller's office can help root out that waste.
Yeah, actually, another major function of the controller's office is the audit function. And Controller Thompson has done a tremendous job in auditing, and I think I would like to expand upon that. I work very closely with him on the Snapple contract, opposing the Snapple deal, which in the end the administration recognized was a mistake. It was a no-bid contract that the Department of Education did, which cost the city hundreds of millions of dollars more than they could have spent over a long period of time, and they unwound that contract. We need more competitive bidding. We need more looking at all sorts of outside contract. One place major cuts can be made, or trims, as I should say, is the Department of Education, where there are cuts that can be made, or trims that can be made, that don't affect the classroom, and a lot of it is the outsourcing of contracts, the testing. Our kids in the public school are over-tested. In some ways, you feel sometimes, if you have children in elementary school, my kids are a little older, but my brother's kids are still in elementary school. And constantly, it's like a Stanley Kaplan review course to take the 4th grade test, the 5th grade test. You'd think they were studying for the bar exam. I think we have to have less emphasis on testing. And by the way, that's hundreds of millions of dollars of contracting that went into hiring all these outside agencies that did the testing.
When you talk about finding place to cut, in this last round of budget balancing, when the mayor said, let's raise taxes, I worked with 2 colleagues, Tish James and Vinnie Gentile, and we put out a letter with specific proposals, not just say, oh, cut waste, cut fraud, but $200 million of specific places to cut. We looked at which agencies are spending more than 10% on overhead. Most agencies are less than 10%, but a few are spending 13, 15% on overhead. They can bring that down. We propose common sense ideas like energy efficient lighting in the schools and in the public housing that would save money day in, day out. And we said there are some things that are luxuries that in better times we can afford, but in these times we have to distinguish between the necessities and the luxuries.
CityWide will continue this conversation with our 2 city controller candidates right after this.
Hey, Sarah.
Oh my gosh, he's so cute.
Been doing like I taught you. Love the new tattoo, Sarah.
Dude, that's Sarah. The girl in the pink shirt. That's the girl I was telling you about.
Theater 2 on your left. Hey, Sarah. What color underwear today?
Hey, Sarah. So when are you going to post something new?
Anything you post online, anyone can see. So think before you post.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with New York City Council members David Weprin and David Yassky, both of them candidates for New York City Controller. The Citizens Budget Commission has issued a report that has some startling statistics and conclusions in it. They found that the total compensation for typical city workers now exceeds that for comparable positions in the private sector, that a typical, or I guess the average city worker, total compensation package over $100,000. For firemen, it's $186,000, salary, pension, health benefits, and the like. A 63% increase over 2000. Benefits up 182%. These are increases 3 times as much as other state and local governments, 4 times as much as the private sector, and ahead of the rate of inflation. What does that mean to us?
Well, a lot of it is collective bargaining, and it's the administration's, sole priority, sole jurisdiction to negotiate labor contracts. The city council doesn't get involved in labor negotiations, and a lot of these are negotiated.
But you still have to appropriate the money to pay for the contracts.
Yeah, we do, but a lot of it is negotiated through collective bargaining. Yeah, you have to keep in mind our police and firefighters still get paid less than our suburban counterparts, than Nassau and Suffolk County, than Westchester County, in order to compete in the marketplace. These are very dangerous jobs. These are hard workers. There's no question that there's flexibility in negotiations.
But it goes back to the question of whether or not Bloomberg has been a good manager. If his contracts with public employees have been so much more generous than what other mayors and governors have done.
Well, look, there's no question that that's becoming an escalating situation. What I think has to be done is the mayor has to bring the labor unions as part of the process into negotiating where they can save money, where there can be a situation where the overall compensation for their members is not compromised. At the same time, there are certain concessions that can help.
And what's the likelihood of that happening in an election year?
Well, it's probably not likely in an election year, but at the same time, I think everybody has to realize that we're in a fiscal crisis, and the labor unions as well don't want to see layoffs. They don't want to see, reduction of headcount. Right now, we've reduced the police headcount by eliminating some of the class or reducing some of the class. The City Council and David and I were involved in that as well, in restoring some of the recent police class. I think that's important. But at the same time, I think we have to look at the overall picture. One thing we did do in the council, and I was very much involved in as head of the finance committee, was setting aside, when we had a surplus, a large surplus, $2.5 billion for our healthcare trust fund. And now that we're in, became like kind of a rainy day fund for healthcare needs. And what we're actually doing now is, in order to deal with our fiscal situation, and we're in much better shape than the state for that reason, we're actually tapping into that healthcare trust fund to cover some of these costs that are associated with retirees' benefits that we legally can do. And I think that'll make it a little easier.
Are you, David Yassky, are you sanguine with the notion that the city's compensation packages have been so much ahead of the private sector, other local governments, and the rate of inflation?
Look, I think the Citizens Budget Commission and that report you talk about did a great service by bringing this to light. I mean, I don't think we sweep it under the rug. Like Al Gore talked about an inconvenient truth about the environment and global warming. This is an inconvenient truth that our regular cost of doing business as a city government has just gotten too high for the tax base to sustain. And I think you're right to suggest that Mayor Bloomberg has not done as good a job as he should have in keeping those costs down. The whole city budget is built on an economy of 2005, 6, 7 that was this real boom period. Some of that may have even been illusory, but whether it was or not, now that's not the economy we have. And we've got to have a budget that we can afford with the current economy. And the workforce has to be part of it.
So let me ask you this question. As the chief fiscal officer of the city comes January 1st, 2010, whoever the mayor is, Bloomberg, Thompson, Weiner, somebody else, if you were asked to weigh in, and by the way, you can answer this as a council member who's going to be voting on the budget in the next year, but let's take it in the role of controller. If you were asked to weigh in as to what direction the city should try and drive its negotiations, should it be reducing the benefits, slowing the rate of compensation, maybe wage deferrals the way it was done in the fiscal crisis, as a way of cutting or capping costs, or reducing the size of the workforce? In other words, keeping the workforce as a better paid workforce, but a smaller workforce. Which philosophically do you believe is the right way for the city to go?
Well, I think actually you could probably do a little bit of all of the above. One of the proposals that I've made and support is an early retirement package, where you have an incentive for seasoned employees who are being paid much higher rates of pay than more junior employees to have an incentive to take early retirement, where you can actually reduce the workforce, bring in people at a much lower salary to do the same type of jobs, and it's kind of a win-win situation. It's something that a lot of the senior employees in the city would like to see. At the same time, it avoids layoffs, and it doesn't really reduce the overall headcount, but it reduces the actual dollar amount that the city has to pay out.
But it also pushes, because your pension costs over time will go up. It sort of pushes some of it out into the future.
Yeah, and we've done too much of that, too much of pushing today's costs onto our children and our grandchildren. Some of these costs have just got to be brought down, and pensions is one of them. of the numbers that you threw out at the beginning of this segment, one you didn't mention to me is the most troubling. The cost of pensions, the city's contributions to the pension funds, has gone up 700%, 7 times what it was in 2000. That's not sustainable, obviously. A lot of private companies are working with their workforce. And by the way, I think that absolutely the workforce has got to be part of this. You can't just impose things. You have to bring them in and have a discussion and a consensus if you can get it. They're offering their workforce, look, would you rather have reductions in wages, benefits, or at least kind of freezing of it so inflation takes care of it, or would you rather have some reduction in the number of employees? And they're working with the workforce on a cooperative solution.
Well, I agree with bringing the workforce in and bringing the labor unions in because most of our city employees are all members of unions and different unions, but I think it's very important that the unions be part of the solution and not just be the problem.
So let me put another sort of union issue on the table. We'll move on to some other things beyond the employee situation in a second, but for much of the 90s, one of the debates in the city council was whether or not police officers should be required to live in the city of New York. A lot of the police force lives in Long Island, and that was viewed as an impediment to having a more diverse police department and one that reflected the communities of color in New York City. And the council pushed very hard that cops should live in the city. They weren't able to accomplish that. Now there's been an initiative by District Council 37. They represent a lot of the city workers and the non-uniformed services that says it's too expensive for our members to live in New York, and instead we should let them live anywhere they want in the metropolitan area because the cost of living is cheaper in some of the far suburbs. Part of the impact of that would be that dollars that they're now spending in New York City would now be spent in the communities where they move to. What is your view on whether or not the council should allow city residents in that union to not have to be city residents?
I support allowing city employees to live in the suburbs. I really do. Look, and in Brooklyn, we have a lot of city employees in Central Brooklyn, and Flatbush, and Sheepshead Bay. There are tons of city workers, and the city's gotten to be such an expensive place to live that a regular income can't support it in a lot of neighborhoods. And rather than tell people, no, you can't, if you have a child, you've got to stay in a one-bedroom apartment, I think we ought to give them the option of the suburbs.
And that would apply also to police then, that you don't...
Well, that is existing. Look, it's existing for police.
So you are not supporting forcing the police to live in the city?
That's the rule now. No one's going to change that. The issue on the table is for city employees, somebody who collects payments at the Department of Finance, a clerk at the Department of Transportation. Should that person, who could be earning $45,000, $50,000 a year, should you force them to live in the city or give them the option of suburbs if they have a child, if they have 2 kids? I think we should give them the option. Yeah,
I also supported DC 37's effort to remove the requirement, and part of it was an equity situation because the police, fire, teachers have had it for a long time, and it was only fair. It was a fairness equity situation. However, I think we can provide incentives to encourage our public employees to live in the city. In the police department and the fire department in particular, they've made a major effort in recruitment as part of their diversity expansion. And the police department had the latest classes have been majority minority and women, as opposed to previous classes where they're almost exclusively white males in the old days. So part of that recruitment effort also encourages recruiting in neighborhoods in New York City where you're more likely to have a New York City resident. So I think you can accomplish both. You can not restrict your government employees from living outside, at the same time encourage them to live in the city. And actually I would even encourage benefits possibly for city residents that are public employees that might not be available to suburban employees.
My thanks to Brooklyn City Councilmember David Yassky and Queens City Councilmember David Weprin. Our conversation is going to continue on the next episode of CityWide. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us.